Guildhall, London. 16th of November, 1848. Frédéric Chopin lowers himself onto a piano stool, his lungs riddled with tuberculosis, his fingers barely steady. The audience falls silent. For the final public performance of his life, he has chosen a Broadwood. 4 years earlier, the Broadwood factory in Westminster was producing 2,300 pianos a year, shipping them to emperors, concert halls, and drawing rooms across the known world. Beethoven had called his Broadwood an altar consecrated to Apollo. Haydn declared nothing could compare. The name carried a weight no other instrument maker could match. By 1842, Broadwood was one of London's 12 largest employers. By the 1860s, it had built over 124,000 instruments. Today, the factory where those pianos were made stands in East London, and it is being demolished. In its place, student accommodation worth £55 million. How does the oldest piano manufacturer in the world, maker of Beethoven's most prized possession, the instrument beneath Chopin's dying hands, end up reduced to a demolition notice? Somewhere between the first chisel strike in a Soho workshop and the last piano ever to leave Old Ford, the answer waits. In 1761, a 29-year-old joiner from Oldhamstocks, a village in the Scottish lowlands so small it barely warranted a name, stepped off a coach in London with a set of woodworking tools and no particular prospects. His name was John Broadwood. He had no capital, no connections, and no reason to believe that within 12 years he would control the most important musical instrument workshop in Britain. He found work almost immediately, which says something about the quality of his hands. Burkhard Schutte, a Swiss craftsman who had arrived in London some 4 decades earlier, ran a harpsichord workshop off Great Pulteney Street in Soho. Schutte was not merely successful, he was celebrated. His clients included Frederick, Prince of Wales, and Frederick the Great of Prussia. A Schutte harpsichord was not a purchase. It was a statement of rank. When the young Scottish joiner presented himself, Schutte recognized the precision of the work and took him on. What followed was not a fairy tale. It was something more deliberate than that. Broadwood spent 8 years learning every aspect of the trade, the grain of the wood, the tension of the strings, the geometry that determined whether an instrument sang or merely rang. He studied Schutte's methods with the patience of a man who understood that knowledge, accumulated quietly, was the only currency that mattered. And then in 1769, he married Barbara Schutte, the craftsman's younger daughter. Whether this was love, ambition, or some compound of both is a question the historical record declines to answer. What it does record is the outcome. In 1771, the aging Schutte formally handed over the running of the business to his son Burkhard the Younger and to Broadwood jointly. 2 years later, in 1773, Schutte died. The workshop passed, by bequest, to both men. But it was Broadwood who became its effective head. The immigrant joiner from Oldhamstocks now ran the finest instrument-making operation in London. He might have been content to preserve what he had inherited. He was not. By the time Broadwood assumed control, the harpsichord was already in quiet trouble, though few in the trade were willing to say so aloud. The instrument had dominated European music for nearly 2 centuries. Its mechanism was fixed. Quills plucked strings, producing a sound that was bright, precise, and entirely unable to vary in volume, regardless of how hard the player struck the keys. For the drawing room music of the Baroque, this had been perfectly adequate. But taste was shifting. Audiences wanted something that could whisper and roar within the same passage. Something that responded to emotion, rather than merely recording it. The piano offered exactly that. Its mechanism used hammers rather than quills, allowing the player's touch to govern the sound directly. The instrument had been developing across Europe since the early 1700s, but it remained technically inconsistent and commercially marginal. Most harpsichord makers regarded it with the skepticism that established craftsmen reserve for anything that threatens to make their expertise obsolete. Broadwood regarded it differently. Through the 1770s and 1780s, he began systematically improving the instrument. He moved the rest plank, the block of wood that held the tuning pins, to the back of the case, improving stability. He replaced the hand stops with pedals. In 1789, at the suggestion of the Bohemian pianist Jan Ladislav Dussek, he extended the range of his grand piano beyond 5 octaves and then to a full 6 octaves by 1794. Each change was methodical, grounded in physics rather than fashion, and each brought the instrument closer to the range of expression that serious composers were beginning to demand. In 1785, Thomas Jefferson, then American minister to France and a keen amateur musician, visited Broadwood's workshop on Great Pulteney Street to discuss the new instruments. He left impressed. The visit was a signal. Broadwood pianos were no longer a craftsman's experiment. They were attracting the attention of the world. In 1793, Broadwood made a decision that was either visionary or reckless, depending on one's perspective. He ceased production of the harpsichord entirely. Every bench in the workshop, every trained pair of hands, every inch of the Soho premises, all of it redirected to the piano. No other major maker had gone so far. Most were hedging, keeping one foot in the old trade. Broadwood removed the option. He was right. John Broadwood died in 1812, aged 79. By then, the firm's reputation was established beyond serious challenge. But the true scale of what he had set in motion, the factories, the royal warrants, the instruments that would pass through the hands of the greatest musicians of the century, he never lived to see. His name, however, would appear on every one of them. By 1823, the Soho workshop could no longer contain what John Broadwood's sons had inherited. The family took a lease on a far larger premises at 33 Horse Ferry Road in Westminster, an ancient thoroughfare that had once served the horse ferry crossing the Lambeth, where travelers paid tolls to the Archbishop of Canterbury before London Bridge existed. It was an unlikely setting for the world's finest piano manufactory. The building sat wedged between a brewery and a marble works, its brick walls absorbing the smells of malt and stone dust alongside the more refined scent of spruce and beech. Inside, however, something remarkable was taking shape. The Broadwood operation was structured on a principle that set it apart from almost every competitor in the trade. All parts were made in-house. The soundboards, the frames, the keys, the hammers, the strung backs. Every component was the work of Broadwood craftsmen, on Broadwood benches, under Broadwood supervision. This was not sentiment. It was a calculated rejection of the fragmentation that cheaper manufacturers relied upon, and it produced an instrument whose consistency was audible. A Broadwood from the 1830s and a Broadwood from the 1850s sounded unmistakably like Broadwoods. The results were staggering. By the 1840s, the factory was producing approximately 2,500 pianos every year. Between 1780 and 1861, a period spanning just over 8 decades, the firm built 124,48 instruments. The numbers bear repeating not because they are large in an industrial sense, but because each of those instruments was a handmade object of considerable complexity assembled by skilled workers in a trade that resisted the shortcuts available to factories producing simpler goods. London in this period was the undisputed capital of piano manufacturing. More than 130 factories operated across the city, concentrated largely in Islington, their output feeding a domestic and export market of extraordinary appetite. The piano had become, in the course of a single generation, the defining object of middle-class aspiration. To own one was to signal cultivation, prosperity, and a certain understanding of how a household ought to present itself to the world. To own a Broadwood was to signal something further, that one had not merely bought a piano, but acquired the instrument of Haydn and Beethoven. Broadwood shipped accordingly. Their export ledgers record deliveries to Australia, India, New Zealand, and South Africa. The empire as a distribution network for polished English craftsmanship. Instruments reached the Falkland Islands. One arrived on St. Helena in 1816, consigned to the Austrian commissioner, appointed to supervise Napoleon Bonaparte in his exile. Whether Napoleon ever heard it played is not recorded. That a Broadwood piano preceded him to the ends of the earth speaks for itself. The technical ambitions of the firm kept pace with its commercial growth. Broadwood's craftsmen pursued improvements in the metal frame throughout the mid-century, seeking greater sustain and structural stability under the higher string tensions that larger concert halls demanded. When the 1862 International Exhibition in London asked manufacturers to submit their finest instruments, Broadwood won a gold medal and marked the occasion by publishing a catalog listing every piano they had produced since 1780. The total ran to 124,048. It was not a boast. It was a statement of record. But within the factory's own logic lay a tension that would take decades to surface. The in-house philosophy, so central to the quality of the product, made the firm slow to mechanize. German and American manufacturers were already investing in machinery that could cut, shape, and finish components at a fraction of the cost of skilled handwork. Broadwood's craftsmen were among the finest in the trade. They were also among the most expensive to employ and the most resistant, with some justification, to methods that reduced their labor to the supervision of machines. For the moment, reputation held. A Broadwood was not purchased on price. It was purchased because no other piano sounded quite like it, and because the name on the fallboard carried 2 centuries of accumulated trust. Concert pianists specified it by name. Households that could afford nothing else would save for one. The factory on Horseferry Road hummed with a kind of controlled urgency, the sound of an institution that understood its own importance, and had not yet been given reason to doubt it. That reason was coming. It would arrive not from a competitor, nor from a change in taste, but from the particular appetites of the men who played the Broadwood best. There is a moment in the history of any institution when its reputation ceases to be a claim it makes about itself and becomes instead something the world simply accepts as fact. For John Broadwood and Sons, that moment arrived sometime in the 1840s, when the firm employed more labor than almost any other business in the capital. By that decade, Broadwood stood among London's 12 largest employers, a position achieved not through the manufacture of cannon or cloth or coal, but through the making of musical instruments. The fact seemed almost improbable. The fact was also incontestable. The firm had earned it one piano at a time and one musician at a time. Joseph Haydn was among the first of the truly great to confirm what Broadwood already suspected about its own instruments. When Haydn arrived in London in 1791 for the first of his celebrated visits, he encountered the Broadwood Grand and declared that no instrument he had previously played could compare with it. This was not courtesy. Haydn was not a man given to empty flattery, and he was, by 1791, the most admired composer in Europe. His endorsement carried a weight that no advertisement could manufacture. Word moved through the concert halls and drawing rooms of London with a velocity that the firm's own salesmen could not have achieved in a decade of effort. But it was what happened in Vienna in the winter of 1818 that would fix the Broadwood name in musical history beyond any possibility of revision. Thomas Broadwood, grandson of the firm's founder and the man whose name had been added to the partnership in 1808, was not content to wait for greatness to come to him. He traveled to the continent specifically to call upon Ludwig van Beethoven, who was by then living in Vienna in a condition of advancing deafness that had reduced his ability to perform, but had done nothing whatsoever to diminish the force of his composition. Beethoven was 57 years old. He was difficult, brilliant, and notoriously suspicious of gestures that smelled of commerce. Thomas Broadwood brought him a piano. It was a 6-octave grand, the finest the factory had produced, specially strung for additional resonance, its case carrying the signatures of 5 distinguished musicians as testament to its quality. Beethoven received it with an emotion that contemporaries found striking even by his standards. He called it, in a letter written shortly after, an altar upon which he would place the choicest offerings of his mind to the divine Apollo. He kept it for the remainder of his life. When he died in 1827, the Broadwood Grand was still in his rooms. For Thomas Broadwood, the journey to Vienna was the defining act of his career, the moment at which the firm's ambitions and the century's greatest musical mind met and recognized one another. He would not live to see the full extent of what that moment had seeded. He died in 1828, his name carried forward by the company that bore it, his own story largely absorbed into the larger narrative of the family enterprise. History remembers the piano. It has been less diligent about remembering the man who carried it over the Alps. The Beethoven piano was not an isolated case. It was the most dramatic expression of a pattern that repeated itself across the century. The greatest keyboard players of each generation gravitating, by preference or by conviction, toward the instrument made in Westminster. Frédéric Chopin arrived in London in the spring of 1848 in a condition that those around him described with the careful understatement of people who do not wish to acknowledge how little time remains. His tuberculosis had progressed to the point where climbing a flight of stairs required a period of recovery. He was 38 years old. He gave lessons to sustain himself financially, accepted the hospitality of Scottish admirers who installed him in a succession of comfortable houses, and played, when he could, for the small gatherings that his health permitted. He had reservations about English audiences. Too composed, he felt, too reluctant to surrender to the music. He had fewer reservations about English pianos. Although Chopin's deepest preference was for the French maker Pleyel, whose instruments responded to his particular touch with what he described as a silvery quality, he played Broadwoods throughout his time in Britain. There was in the Broadwood, he acknowledged, a fullness of tone, a depth in the lower register, that served his purposes in the larger rooms he was obliged to perform in. On the 16th of November, 1848, Chopin took the stage at the Guildhall in London for a charity concert in aid of Polish exiles. It was the last public performance of his life. He played for approximately an hour, his playing described by those present as possessed of an intimacy entirely disproportionate to the size of the room, as though the music were addressed to each listener individually rather than the assembled hall. The piano beneath his hands was a Broadwood. He died in Paris the following October. 38 years later, Franz Liszt, by then an old man making what everyone understood to be his final tour, played a Broadwood grand on his last visit to London in 1886. The instrument he chose was the product of the same Horse Ferry Road factory that had supplied Beethoven, had sustained Chopin through his final season, and had shipped pianos to every corner of an empire that was still, in 1886, close to its own peak. The Broadwood at this moment appeared impregnable. Its reputation rested on verified history rather than marketing, on instruments that the greatest musicians of the century had preferred not because they were paid to prefer them, but because the pianos were, by any serious measure, extraordinary. The factory was at full production. The order books were full. The royal warrant was secure. None of this, as it turned out, was a guarantee of anything. The historical record of John Broadwood and Sons is, in one respect, lopsided. It preserves in considerable detail the names and opinions of the men who played the pianos. It is considerably less forthcoming about the men who made them. This is not an accident. The archives held at Surrey History Center, themselves a remarkable resource, running to thousands of documents, track the movement of individual instruments from the factory floor to their eventual owners with meticulous precision. Each piano had a serial number. The ledgers record when it was completed, when it was sold, and to whom it was delivered. The instrument's journey is documented from the moment it left the craftsman's hands. The craftsman himself is largely absent from the record. We know the categories of their work, if not always their names. A Broadwood grand piano in the mid-19th century required the labor of men whose skills were as distinct from one another as those of a surgeon from a carpenter. The soundboard, the thin, precisely graduated sheet of spruce that determined the instrument's voice more than any other single component, was the province of specialists who had spent years learning to read the grain of the wood with their fingertips, to hear the difference between a board that would sing and one that would merely vibrate. The iron frame, which bore the enormous cumulative tension of the strings, demanded the kind of metalwork that a blacksmith would not have recognized as his own trade. The hammers required layers of felt pressed to a consistency measured not in units but in feel. The strings themselves were wound under tensions calculated to produce specific pitches whilst leaving room for the inevitable shifts of a British climate. All of this happened on the same premises. That was the point. The in-house philosophy that made Broadwood instruments consistent and trustworthy also meant that the factory contained, within a single set of walls, an extraordinary concentration of specialized human knowledge. The men who worked on Horse Ferry Road were not factory hands in the sense that the cotton mills of Manchester or the iron foundries of Birmingham produced factory hands. They were craftsmen, trained, skilled, and aware of their own value. They were also, by any objective measure, poorly positioned to argue for it. The piano trade in Victorian London was not a unionized industry. The craftsmen's leverage lay in the scarcity of their skills rather than in any collective organization, and that leverage diminished steadily as the century progressed. German and American manufacturers were mechanizing with a speed and commitment that the British trade was reluctant to match. By the 1870s, firms in New York and Hamburg were producing instruments at a cost per unit that Broadwood's hand-finishing methods could not approach. The gap was not initially audible in the quality of the instrument. A Broadwood still sounded better than most of what the mechanized factories were producing, but the gap was visible in the price list, and in a market that was expanding rapidly downward into the homes of families for whom a Broadwood was aspirational rather than attainable, visible price differences had consequences. Broadwood's response was characteristically deliberate and characteristically slow. The firm commissioned advice from scientists and engineers during the 1840s, an early and rather unusual acknowledgement that instrument making had become as much a technical discipline as a craft tradition. Improvements to the metal frame followed, pushing the instrument toward greater power and sustain. But the fundamental model, skilled men working by hand, producing components to exacting tolerances that machines of the era could not reliably replicate, remained intact. It was a point of pride. It was also, increasingly, a point of vulnerability. Meanwhile, the men on the factory floor inhabited a world entirely remote from the concert platforms on which their work was celebrated. Consider the distance. In 1818, when Thomas Broadwood carried a Broadwood Grand over the Alps to present to Beethoven in Vienna, the composer received it with something approaching reverence. He called it an altar. He kept it in his rooms like a relic. The piano, this specific object, built on a bench in Soho by craftsmen whose names are not recorded, became part of the furniture of musical legend. It was handled by the hands of the greatest composer of the age. It was played in rooms where some of the 19th century's most significant music was first heard. The men who built it would not have been admitted to those rooms. This is not a simple matter of class grievance. It is a structural observation about how the value of skilled work was distributed in 19th century Britain. The craftsman's contribution was essential and was understood to be essential. Without the accumulated expertise of the Broadwood workshops, there was no altar, no Beethoven piano, no Chopin at the Guildhall. And yet the economic logic of the trade ran in a single direction, upward toward the owners and the reputation they cultivated, and outward toward the clients whose endorsements sustained that reputation. The craftsman occupied the center of the entire enterprise and remained in all the ways that the historical record measures such things at its periphery. By the time the lease on Horseferry Road expired in 1902, and the firm moved its production to Old Ford Works in Hackney, a larger facility, equipped with new machinery and organized along more explicitly industrial lines, the old balance between craft and manufacture had already begun to tip. The new factory was a necessary concession to economic reality. The machinery installed there could perform tasks that had previously required years of training. Some of that training became, with the arrival of the machines, redundant. The craftsmen who had carried the knowledge in their hands and the grain-reading precision of their fingertips and the calibrated judgment of their ears found that modernity had a use for their labor, but a diminishing need for what distinguished it. They had built instruments that Beethoven called sacred. The century that followed would not treat their own skills with equivalent reverence. The move to Hackney in 1902 was presented in the trade press of the time as a triumph of modernization. The Old Ford Works on the Stour Road was a purpose-built facility, larger and better equipped than anything the firm had previously occupied, and the editors of The Engineer devoted considerable space to a description of its new machinery and methods. Broadwood, the coverage implied, had entered the 20th century with its ambitions intact and its methods refreshed. The photographs show a clean, well-lit factory. The caption writers were enthusiastic. What the photographs did not show was the degree to which the move represented an acknowledgement of pressure rather than an expression of confidence. The Horseferry Road lease had expired, that much was straightforward. But the investment in new machinery, the reorganization of the production floor, the diversification into player pianos, instruments that played themselves, operated by pneumatic mechanisms fed by a punched paper roll, these were the responses of a firm that understood the market was changing in ways that craft tradition alone could not address. The player piano was in its way a remarkable object. It required no musical training to operate, A household that possessed neither the time nor the aptitude for lessons could fill its rooms with music by the simple act of pumping a pair of pedals. Broadwood produced them from 1902 onwards, and they sold. The firm even manufactured one sufficiently robust to accompany an expedition to the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. In 1910, a Broadwood player piano was loaded onto a ship bound for Antarctica as part of Captain Robert Falcon Scott's Terra Nova expedition. It was carried to the first base camp and installed, against all geographical logic, in the expedition's winter quarters. On the ice, in temperatures that cracked timber and froze ink in its bottles, the instrument was played. The men gathered around it in the brief periods between the brutal work of survival and scientific observation, and they listened to music produced by a mechanism built on the Stour Road hackney. It was, in its absurdity and its poignancy, a perfectly Broadwood moment. The instrument of Beethoven and Chopin, operated by a paper roll, performing for frostbitten explorers at the end of the world. It was also, without anyone recognizing it as such, the last moment of uncomplicated Broadwood glory. On the 4th of August 1914, the factory on Stour Road was on its annual summer holiday. The workers had laid down their tools. The production floor was quiet. Somewhere in London that morning, the cabinet was meeting. Across Europe, mobilization orders were being distributed to armies that had been waiting, with varying degrees of patience, for exactly this moment. By the evening, Britain was at war with Germany. The Broadwood ledgers record the day with an inadvertent precision that no journalist could have contrived. On the 4th of August 1914, a piano was sold to Selfridges. The entry sits in the porter's book like a fragment of a vanished world, a routine commercial transaction completed on the last morning before routine commercial transactions ceased to be possible. By the end of that month, 7 pianos had been dispatched to New Zealand. They were among the last instruments to leave the factory under anything resembling normal conditions. Within weeks, the machinery at Old Ford was being assessed for war production. The War Office had requirements that Broadwood's facilities could meet. The factory, which had spent a century and a half producing instruments of extraordinary delicacy, turned its benches and its workforce to the manufacture of aircraft bodies and component parts for the de Havilland Aircraft Company. It produced ammunition boxes. It contributed, in whatever ways a piano factory could contribute, to the material requirements of a war that was consuming the continent at a rate no one had predicted and no one knew how to stop. There is an irony in this that was noted at the time and has been repeated so often since that it risked losing its force through familiarity. The wooden biplanes that Broadwood helped to build were held together and apart with piano wire, high tensile steel string, the same material wound under tension across the frames of Broadwood instruments, now strung between the wing struts of fragile aircraft flown by young men over the fields of France. The firm that had provided Beethoven with an altar had become, by the logic of total war, a supplier to the Royal Flying Corps. The war ended in 1918. The factory resumed piano production, but the market it returned to was not the market it had left. 4 years of industrialized slaughter had altered, in ways both measurable and indefinable, the appetite of British households for domestic music making. The gramophone, which Broadwood had briefly and not entirely convincingly diversified into during the 1920s, was positioning itself as the technology of the future, cheaper than a piano, requiring no skill, filling a room with the recorded voices of musicians rather than the effortful approximations of the household's own. The middle-class drawing room, which had driven Broadwood's extraordinary expansion across the Victorian era, was reorganizing itself around new objects and new habits. The order books did not collapse overnight. They contracted, slowly at first, then with a steadiness that left no room for comfortable interpretation. The firm moved production again to Kingsbury Works at the Hyde in Hendon as the decades passed and the economics of the trade continued their patient, remorseless work against everything that had once made the Broadwood factory seem permanent. The Old Ford chimney kept its smoke until it didn't. There is no single document in the Broadwood archive that records the precise date on which the last piano left the Old Ford Works. History, when it concerns itself with endings, tends to preserve the dramatic closures, the signed armistices, the final editions, the last trains. The quieter terminations, the ones that happen not with ceremony, but with the gradual absence of sound, are harder to fix in the record. What the archive establishes is a trajectory. By 1950, production at Stour Road had ceased. The firm had moved. The factory that had stood at the center of Broadwood's identity for nearly half a century was done. What follows is what that morning would have looked like, reconstructed from what we know of the building, the trade, and the particular weight of an ending that nobody announced. October light in Hackney arrives late and leaves early. By 7:30, the sky above the old Ford chimney had moved from black to a flat, colorless gray that promised nothing. The chimney itself, a tall stack of London stock brick, the same yellow-brown as almost every significant structure east of the city, had been drawing smoke since the factory's boiler was first fired in 1902. On this morning, it drew less. The boiler was running at reduced pressure. There was no longer any need for the full heat that a production day demanded. Inside, the factory floor had the particular quality of a room that has not been entirely itself for some time. The smell was still there, or rather the composite of smells that anyone who had worked in the building for more than a week could have identified in darkness. Spruce and beech were the foundation of it, the clean resinous scent of soundboard timber that had been stacked and seasoned in the upper storage racks until it reached the precise moisture content required. Beneath that, the sharper chemical notes of varnish and size, the glues and sealants applied to the casework at various stages of completion. And beneath that, almost inextricably woven into the brickwork and the floorboards, the faint metallic trace of high tensile steel, the wire that had been wound and cut and tuned on these benches for 48 years. A piano is, when you examine it without sentiment, an object of implausible ambition. It asks that wood, metal, felt, and leather be assembled into a mechanism capable of producing, from a single instrument, a dynamic range from the barely audible to the physically forceful, across 7¼ octaves, with a consistency of tone that holds across every register and a reliability of action that persists through decades of daily use in rooms of varying temperature and humidity. The number of individual components required to achieve this runs to several thousand. The number of decisions a craftsman makes in the course of assembling them, decisions about tension, about fit, about the pressure of a finger against a hammer shank to test its give, is effectively uncountable. On the benches that remained active in the factory's final weeks, those decisions were still being made. An unfinished instrument does not wait courteously for the commercial situation to resolve itself. Its components, once shaped and joined, begin a slow conversation with the atmosphere around them. Wood moves. Glued joints either hold or they begin, almost imperceptibly, to release. A soundboard that was correctly graduated 6 months ago may have shifted since. The craftsmen who worked through the factory's last period of production were not maintaining a museum piece. They were completing real instruments with the same attention to the same details that the trade had demanded since Horseferry Road. The soundboard specialist, and there was always one in any Broadwood shop worth the name, worked at a bench set slightly apart from the main production line, in a patch of light that, in the morning, came from the north-facing windows and was therefore cool, even, and reliable for the purposes of reading grain. The board before him was a sheet of European spruce approximately 5 feet in length, graduated by hand across its width so that it was thicker at the center and thinner toward the edges. A variation of fractions of a millimeter that would determine, more than any other single factor, the voice of the finished instrument. He ran his thumb across it in the particular arc that decades of practice had made automatic, feeling for inconsistencies that a gauge could not reliably detect. In another part of the floor, the hammers were being voiced. This was work that required a set of needles and an ear trained to distinguish between a tone that was marginally too bright and one that was marginally too dull, a distinction that exists below the threshold of ordinary perception, but that a concert pianist, placing their hands on the keys for the first time, would register within moments. The voicer worked in near silence, pressing the needles into the felt at precisely calculated angles, then striking the corresponding key and listening, with the focused attention of someone who has learned to hear what most people cannot, for the change. At the far end of the building, near the loading doors that opened onto Stour Road, several completed instruments stood in cases awaiting dispatch. They were upright models, their cases finished in a dark mahogany veneer, their lids closed. They did not look like the final products of a dying operation. They looked, as they always had, like Broadwoods. By mid-morning, the boiler had settled to its reduced rhythm, and the building carried a quiet that was different in texture from its usual working silences. A factory that is producing things has a background hum even in its quieter moments. The accumulated sound of small tasks, of tools set down and picked up, of timber shifted on a rack, of a mallet tapped once against a joint to test its set. This quiet was of a different kind. It was the quiet of reduction, of a place that had been subtracting itself for some time and had now subtracted most of what it was. The craftsmen who remained, and there were fewer of them now than there had been even 5 years before, worked without particular ceremony. There is no evidence that anyone made a speech. No evidence that the final piano to leave the building was marked in any way that distinguished it from the thousands that had preceded it. The trade does not tend toward the theatrical. Men who have spent their working lives making things with their hands are generally not inclined, when the making stops, to stand in a row and be photographed. What they may have felt is a different question, and one the record cannot answer. Consider what those hands had built in this building alone. Between 1902 and 1950, the old Ford Works had produced instruments that went to concert halls and ocean liners, to colonial outposts in the households of the aspiring middle class, to a base camp in Antarctica and the showroom of Selfridges on the last morning of the Old World. They had produced instruments through 2 world wars, had converted their production to aircraft parts and ammunition boxes, and then converted it back again with the patience of craftsmen who understood that the trade would endure if they did. They had maintained, through all of it, a standard of workmanship that the firm's reputation required, because the reputation was not an abstraction to the men on the floor. It was the reason their particular skills retained any value at all. The last instrument was completed. The last string was tuned. The last hammer was voiced to the satisfaction of the last man to voice it. Then the benches were cleared. The tools went into their cases with the deliberate movements of men who knew precisely where each one belonged. The result of habits so deeply ingrained that they had ceased long ago to require conscious direction. The finishing materials were capped and stored. The remaining stock of soundboard timber, stacked in the upper racks with the same care it had always been given, would need to be assessed for transfer or disposal. Timber this well-seasoned was not to be wasted. The loading doors were closed. The main lights, which had illuminated decades of careful work, were switched off section by section. The factory floor retreating into the dull gray of the October afternoon, coming through the high windows. The chimney above Stour Road stopped drawing. Outside, London 1950 was conducting its own complicated argument with the recent past. The bomb sites were still visible across the East End, cleared of rubble now, many of them, but not yet built upon. Their outlines tracing the geometry of a city that had been partly unmade and was working out, at a pace that satisfied no one, how to remake itself. The piano in this city and in this moment was not the instrument of reconstruction. That role belonged to the new council estates rising in the suburbs, to the prefabricated housing delivered in sections to cleared ground, to the public architecture of the welfare state. The drawing room around which the Victorian piano trade had organized its entire commercial logic was being replaced by something more modest and differently arranged. The craftsmen who walked out of Old Ford that final afternoon walked into a city that was becoming, with some urgency, a place in which what they knew how to do mattered considerably less than it once had. They had built instruments that Beethoven called sacred. They had built the piano beneath Chopin's dying hands. They had built the instrument played on the Antarctic ice. They had kept the standard through 2 wars and the long diminuendo of the peacetime years. The brickwork of the old Ford Works retained their heat, their smell, and the faint vibration of 48 years of strung wire. It would retain all of these things in diminishing traces for the 75 years that followed, through the decades of vacancy, through the planning applications, through the surveys and the assessments and the eventual awarding of contracts, until the machinery of a different kind arrived and began, with professional efficiency, to take the walls apart. Captain Evelyn Broadwood became chairman of John Broadwood and Sons in 1931, at a moment when the firm's difficulties were structural rather than merely cyclical. The piano trade had not recovered from the 1920s. The gramophone had taken what the Great War had loosened, and the Depression was doing the rest. Evelyn Broadwood understood all of this. He also understood something that the balance sheets could not fully express, that the firm bearing his family's name was not, in any ordinary sense, a commercial entity. It was a fact of cultural history that had incorporated itself for convenience, and its obligations extended well beyond those owed to creditors and shareholders. He held to that understanding for 44 years. Through the Second World War, through the austerity of the late 1940s, through the move from Hackney to Hendon, and then to further premises as the economics of each location ceased to align with what a much-reduced firm could sustain, Evelyn Broadwood remained at the center of an operation that was contracting steadily around him. He was not by this stage presiding over a factory in any meaningful sense. He was presiding over a reputation, maintaining the royal warrant, keeping the name in circulation, ensuring that when a Broadwood piano required servicing or restoration, there was still a Broadwood firm to perform that service. It was quiet, determined work, and it was almost entirely invisible to anyone outside the trade. Evelyn Broadwood died in 1975. He was the last of his line to hold a position of authority in the firm his great-great-grandfather had built from a Scottish joiner's tools and a Swiss craftsman's daughter. The family home at Lyne House, near Capel in Surrey, was cleared after his death, and the Broadwood archives, thousands of documents accumulated across 2.5 centuries. The ledgers and letters and design drawings that constituted the most complete record of a piano manufacturer's history and existence, were rescued from the house and eventually deposited at Surrey History Center, where they remain available to researchers who wish to trace the ownership history of individual instruments. The rescue of those papers was, in retrospect, among the most significant acts of the firm's final family chapter. Without them, the history of 124 48 pianos would have been largely unretrievable. After Evelyn Broadwood's death, the firm passed through a period of increasing difficulty that those connected to it described with characteristic British restraint as challenging. By the early 1980s, the challenge had become a crisis. The company was close to insolvency. Its reputation remained intact. The name still carried, among those who cared about such things, the full weight of its associations. But reputation, as the firm had been demonstrating for several decades, does not service debt. In the mid-1980s, Geoffrey Simon entered the picture. Simon was a businessman from Birmingham, successful in ways unrelated to music, who happened to be a serious amateur pianist and who regarded the prospect of the Broadwood name disappearing from the trade with something approaching personal affront. He assembled a consortium, acquired the company, assumed the role of chief executive, and applied to its situation the kind of practical energy that the firm had not seen in some years. Under Simon's stewardship, Broadwood began to develop new instruments, including in 1997 a limited edition grand piano designed without the internal cross bars that had been standard in the instrument's construction for over a century. The barless grand was patented and manufactured in modest quantities. It was not a mass-market proposition. It was an assertion that the firm was still capable of innovation, rather than merely maintenance. Simon died in 2006. What followed was, by the standards of Broadwood's history, swift. In 2008, the company was acquired by Alistair Lawrence, a piano builder and technician whose family connections to Broadwood stretch back, in the firm's own records, to 1787. The coincidence, if it was a coincidence, had the quality of something arranged rather than accidental. A man whose ancestors had been part of the Broadwood story since its early decades, returning to take charge of what remained. Under Lawrence, the firm relocated its restoration and conservation work to Finchcox, a Georgian manor house in Goodhurst, Kent, before eventually establishing workshops in Leith, near Whitby in North Yorkshire. The operation is small, deliberate, and entirely serious. New Broadwood pianos are made to order. Historical Broadwood instruments are restored by the firm that built them. The royal warrant, held continuously for longer than almost any other supplier to the Crown, remains in force. Meanwhile, in Hackney, the old Ford Works on Stour Road had been standing empty for decades. its yellow brick walls intact, its chimney still visible above the roof lines of the surrounding streets, its interior accumulating the particular archaeology of long abandonment. Pigeons, damp, the slow migration of plaster from walls to floor. The building sat within a neighborhood that was itself undergoing one of the more dramatic transformations in London's recent geography. The 2012 Olympic Park lay within easy walking distance. 4 universities had established campuses within a 2-mile radius. The population of the area was young, educated, and in need of somewhere to sleep. In 2021, plans were announced for a student accommodation complex on the old Ford site. The project, valued at £55 million, was designed to serve the universities clustered in the surrounding streets. Queen Mary at Mile End, the University of East London at Stratford, Loughborough University's London postgraduate campus, and University College London's presence in the Olympic Park. By October 2025, construction was underway. The developers committed to preserving the chimney and the original boiler house as heritage features within the new development. The chimney that had drawn the smoke of 48 years of piano manufacture would remain standing, incorporated into a building full of student bedrooms. Beethoven had called the instrument made beneath that chimney an altar. The altar's foundry was becoming accommodation. The students who would sleep there would, in all statistical likelihood, know nothing of what the walls around them had once contained. The archive at Surrey History Centre occupies a climate-controlled reading room in Woking, 40 minutes by train from the city that the Broadwood firm helped to define. Researchers who visit to consult the collection are presented with materials that span nearly 3 centuries. Letters in copperplate hand, ledger books whose columns record the movement of individual instruments with the precision of a counting house, that understood, from its earliest days, that each piano had a life independent of its maker. The serial numbers run from the first instruments of the 1780s to the mid-20th century, and for each one the record shows where it survives, the date of completion, the date of sale, and the name of the original purchaser. It is, among other things, a census of where music went. Some of the destinations are grand enough to have found their way into other histories. The piano dispatched to Baron Sturmer on St. Helena in 1816, the Austrian commissioner charged with supervising Napoleon Bonaparte in his island exile, sits in the ledger as a routine entry, its serial number and dimensions noted alongside the delivery instructions and the date it was taken to Portsmouth for loading. Napoleon's proximity to a Broadwood piano is recorded not as a curiosity, but as a commercial transaction. The firm shipped to wherever the order required. The Alps had not detained Thomas Broadwood. The South Atlantic was not a problem either. Other entries carry their significance more quietly. On the 4th of August 1914, the day Britain declared war on Germany, the Porter's book records the sale of a single piano to Selfridges. Somewhere in that department store on that particular morning, a transaction was completed and a piano changed hands while the cabinet met and the telegrams moved between capitals and the century arranged itself into its worst configuration. The piano went to Selfridges. History went elsewhere. The ledger recorded both with equal indifference. A Broadwood upright was shipped to the Reverend L.E. Brandon, colonial chaplain at Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands, on the 25th of May, 1881. 5 Broadwood pianos were removed from the Royal Mail ship Otranto in August 1914, when the Admiralty requisitioned the vessel for military service. The Otranto was sunk in a collision in 1918, taking more than 400 lives. The pianos that had been unloaded from her 4 years earlier survived the war in whatever rooms they had been delivered to. The ship did not. A Broadwood player piano was played on the Antarctic ice in the winter of 1910 by men who were, depending on which of them you follow in the subsequent months, either preparing for the greatest polar journey of the century or preparing to die attempting it. Several of Scott's party died. The piano, having been carried to base camp rather than the pole, survived. The instruments persist in ways their makers could not have predicted and their owners did not always intend. In 2024, a Broadwood grand piano owned by the singer Chesney Hawkes was investigated by the BBC program Fake or Fortune for a possible connection to John Lennon. The theory that Lennon had once owned this specific instrument was not proven. What the investigation did establish through the firm's own records, was that Lennon had at one point owned a Broadwood upright piano. The serial number existed. The ledger had an entry. 2.5 centuries of careful record-keeping had preserved, in a climate-controlled room in Woking, the paper trail of a piano that passed through the hands of a Beatle. John Broadwood and Sons continues to operate. Its workshops, currently located in North Yorkshire, produce new instruments to commission and restore historical Broadwoods with the expertise that only the firm that built them possesses. The scale is entirely different from what it was. The 2,500 pianos a year of the Horseferry Road Peak have given way to a handful of instruments annually, each one a considered object rather than a product of industrial rhythm. The royal warrant remains in force. The name on the fallboard is the same name that appeared on the instrument Beethoven received in Vienna in 1818 on the piano beneath Chopin's hands at the Guildhall in November 1848, on the instrument played on the Antarctic ice, on the one sold to Selfridges on the last morning of the Old World. In Hackney, the chimney above the former Old Ford Works rises above a construction site. The brickwork that absorbed 48 years of piano wire tension and soundboard timber and the particular silence of craftsmen concentrating is being incorporated, by degrees, into the infrastructure of a student accommodation complex worth £55 million. The boiler house will be preserved, the chimney will remain. The developers have spoken of heritage and social value and the importance of the area's industrial history. The rooms being built around it will be occupied by people who are, on the whole, young. Some of them will study music. Some of them will play the piano. Almost none of them will know, when they pass beneath the chimney on their way to lectures or to sleep, what was made in the building whose bones now form the walls of the place they live. Perhaps it does not matter. The pianos are still out there, in concert halls and private houses and restoration workshops and climate-controlled collections. Their serial numbers traceable to a set of ledgers in a reading room in Woking, their voices carrying, in the best of them, something of the accumulated knowledge of craftsmen whose names the record did not always trouble to preserve. The music does not require the building. It never did. What it required was the hands.